Hello and welcome. Today we're looking at 5 pawn endgames that every player should learn. Time and time again, I see players getting these endgames wrong, and if you watch until the end of the video, I do think you'll find some value. Before we get started, please leave a like on the video and hit subscribe for more content. Okay, let's go. Endgame 1. We've got king and pawn versus king. This endgame on your screen is a draw. Let's look at why. Black can never force the white king away from controlling key squares, as we shall see. The way I teach this endgame for the defending side involves following 3 simple rules. We're assuming if you can take the pawn, you take it. Also important to note is that it doesn't matter whose move it is. Okay, rule 1. Rule 1. Occupy the square directly in front of the pawn. The first thing we need to do is occupy the square directly in front of the pawn to stop our opponent advancing. In this example, the square in front of the pawn is c4. From c4, our king controls b5, c5 and d5. This is first on our checklist and always what we look at first. The black king can never step forward whilst we are directly in front of the pawn. Rule number 2. If you already occupy this square and you can't take the pawn, drop 1 square back. The way I teach this endgame to my students is to drop 1 square back. King c3. From here, we are well placed to counter if our opponent comes forward to the right with king d5 or to the left with king b5. Rule number 3. If you can't occupy the square in front of the pawn and you already occupy the square 1 back from the pawn, you need to oppose the enemy king and follow him to the side. By following the enemy king, we keep control of the king and stop him coming forwards. Both kings are in line with each other and it is black to move. These are the 3 rules. Let's see this in action. King is on c4 and occupying. Drop back king c3. Follow the king. King d3. Occupy in front of the pawn. Just stopping for a second, notice that as the pawn comes forward, the square in front of the pawn changes from c4 to c3. King c3, stopping the pawn, and the enemy king must defend it. Okay, let's go again. Drop back, occupy, drop back, follow, and so on. When we get to the bottom of the board, it's stalemate. Practice this on your own until you feel comfortable, as we'll see this again later in endgame number 3. For now, let's go to endgame number 2. Endgame number 2, and we have a king plus pawn on the edge of the board versus king. Here, even with the king in front of the pawn, white can still save the game. White does this by not letting the attacking king escape. The black king is stuck in front of the pawn and can't move out of the way for the pawn to promote. If the defending king reaches the corner, there will be no way to force him out, and this would be the dream square for him. Although there isn't much to cover and go over on this position, it's nevertheless very important. This endgame comes up in games quite often. Knowing this technique can be the difference between a win and a draw, as we shall see in endgame 3, where we need to know this idea. Endgame 3. Take this position. If we look on the left side of the board, also known as the queen side, it's exactly the same as endgame 1, which we know is a draw, but only if these are the only pieces on the board. Looking on the king side, we see black has 2 pawns held up by 1 pawn. Should the g-pawn move, white will recapture en passant and promote the pawn. What's the plan for white? If white abandons the c pawn and heads for the king side, this will lead to a draw. Black is able to reach the same position as endgame 2, as follows. Takes, moves, takes, and black is in time to trap the white king in front of the pawn. The correct plan for white to use is what we know in endgame 1, to stalemate the black king on c8. This forces black to play g6 or g5, and white can now take it and promote to a queen or rook with checkmate on the back row. The importance behind showing you this position is to show that it is possible to go wrong, and not any move wins just because a position is winning. Endgame position 4 involves the square. The square is a way chess players know if a king can catch a pawn before it promotes. As we can see, the pawn on a5 is 4 squares away from promoting. What we do is we draw a square with our eyes. So 4 squares from promoting means we have to count 4 squares to the side too. I've highlighted this for you to show what we mean. You might be thinking, we've drawn a square, what's the significance? Well, the idea is that if the enemy king can step inside the square of the pawn, then he will be able to stop the pawn. In this example, white to move, white plays king e5 and is in the square, so he can catch the pawn. If instead it was black to move, then the white king cannot enter the square, so the pawn will promote. Endgame 5, here we go. King and 3 pawns versus king and 3 pawns. The position is identical, only white has much more space. White to play here. Can you see the winning idea? Okay, the idea is to create a passed pawn for white at any cost, as the kings are too far away to play a role. The move to win is pawn to g6. Just have a look for a moment if you don't see why this wins. Okay, so if black takes with the h pawn, f6 is the key move. Now, if black takes on f6, then pawn to h6, and this pawn promotes first before black's pawns. If instead of taking on f6, black decides to take on h5, white takes on g7, and the game promotes first. I wanted to show you this endgame, as it demonstrates the importance of both having more space and also promoting your own pawn at any cost. So here we sacrifice a pawn, but we promote first and have plenty of time to clean up the remains before delivering checkmate ourselves. We're not finished yet, but I'd like to thank you for watching so far. Please consider subscribing for more content, and consider following us on Instagram for daily content at ChessMadeSimple. We've got puzzles, endgames, openings, all that good stuff. A quick look before we go at this position with king and pawn versus king. This time, the king is in front of its own pawn. I'm planning an in-depth video on gaining the opposition, shouldering, outflanking, and more, so I'll cover this one in detail on that video. Leave me a comment down below with any thoughts on the video. Thanks for watching, and until next time.